Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Sunday Morning Science. I'm very excited about today's lesson presentation. Before I get started, I got an email this week, someone asking me if I'm still going to continue doing my edited videos. And I've got a lot of nice presentations on this YouTube channel that I do a lot of work to edit and kind of perfect them, so there's no ums and buts and things like that, and they're a lot shorter. I will continue doing those, but the reason that I'm doing live shows right now is because the past few months things have been crazy at work and I have no time for video editing. And one of the concerns that he'd had when he emailed me is that because these lessons are usually about an hour long, it's hard, if there's little gems in them here and there, it's hard to share those with people because I got to watch an hour-long video. So I do understand that concern. If you, dear viewer, would like to edit some of my videos and do little clips that, maybe I talk about irreducible complexity in one spot, or I'm going to talk today about the evolution of lungs, for example, and maybe the spot on the evolution of lungs is really cool. It should be its own standalone video. If you want to edit that for me and send it to me as a little clip, I would definitely appreciate that. Some people have taken stuff that I've done and put it up on their own YouTube channel, and that's not ideal because I don't get any sort of revenue for that, but that is better than nothing. So I actually don't mind if people do that as well. But I would prefer it if you would send me clips and I can post them here on my Stated Casually YouTube channel. So that would be absolutely wonderful if anyone would like to do that for me, because right now, really, I have no time at all for video editing. But I will be continuing my series 113 questions about evolution, and I will be continuing eventually my series on evidence for evolution in your own backyard. And so those, I'll probably be able to start doing that maybe in March. But until then, I'll be doing just these live videos. So without further ado, let's look at the evolution of irreducible complexity. I've made some slides for you here. Let me share my screen. Let me see if there's any. Oh, thank you for the super chat. Edited videos don't get those sweet super chats. Thank you. Let's see. And just looking through questions here real quick, or comments. All right, let me just get started on my presentation here. So what evolved first, the brain, the heart, or the stomach? And this is a question kind of about irreducible complexity, right? And today's video is inspired by an angry question, maybe you could call it a question, by Jim Finson on my other YouTube channel, Stated Clearly. And he wrote a bunch of stuff. Like right here is his entire comment if you want to screenshot that and read it later. But he went all out and very angry about evolution after watching my video on the evidence for evolution, where I go over the evolution of whales. He writes, "Hey atheists, aren't you at least a little bit curious as to why no one has ever been able to answer my question asking for a plausible evolutionary order of the 10 vital organs from microbe to microbiologist that passes the laugh test? 4 question marks, all caps. Rip Darwin, 1851 to 2017 by Jim Finson." And he goes on to say, "Man needs all 10 of his vital organs or he dies. Fact. Man is irreducibly complex by definition." And so these are the 10 organs that he wants to know which evolved first: the stomach, the skin, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the upper intestine or the small intestine, the liver, the lower intestine or the large intestine, the pancreas, the kidneys. And he says, remove just one and man dies, and bye-bye evolution. I find this stuff adorable when people who think that they have somehow conquered the theory of evolution, but have clearly never read a biology textbook or understand the basics of it. Now, what he's talking about here is irreducible complexity. And it is true for the most part that if you remove one of these organs, a person will die. It's not true of the lower intestine. Actually, there's lots of people, there's hundreds of people that are living right now without a lower intestine because they have Crohn's disease and they've had their lower intestine removed. What happens there is, the purpose of the lower intestine is to pull water out of your stool before it exits your body, and also salts and a few other things. And so people that have their lower intestine removed, they actually do just fine, but they have to drink a lot more water and they have to really manage their salt intake. But yeah, people can live without that. But for the most part, if you get rid of any of these other organs, you do die. I mean, get rid of your brain, you're dead. Get rid of your lungs, you're dead, and so on. So the reason that I'm responding to this question is not because I think that I'm going to be able to change his mind, or I've seen other people respond to him in the comments, and he refuses to listen to anything that they say. People have given him great answers on this because, like I said, we actually know how all of this stuff evolved. We know quite well how this stuff evolved, and if you would bother to read a textbook, he could actually figure this out for himself. But as a general rule, if someone writes to you in all caps, they're not curious about actually learning something. So I'm not really responding to this because I want to respond to him. I'm responding to this question because it's actually just a really fun thing to think about. What did evolve first? How did these different structures come to exist in our bodies? And it's such a fun question to think about. It's actually been all week as I've had free time, I've been thinking about this and reading different papers and stuff. And it's a really fun topic to study. Like, how did these things evolve step by step? And how do we get the evolution of irreducible complexity? So again, which organs came first? Stomach, skin, heart, lungs, brain, upper intestine, liver, lower intestine, pancreas, kidneys. Think about that. Do you think that you can answer that question off the top of your head? The first thing we need to understand to make sense of this is that our bodies are colonies of cells. You are a colony. And this concept was first presented to us strongly by Theodore Schwann in the 1800s. He was studying, cells under the microscope. And he kind of pieced together everybody else's data. And he's the guy that really just realized we are cells. We are a collection of cells that are cooperating with each other. And this is something that's so obvious to us today. We've heard this a million times that we don't really think about how profound this is, but this is amazing. You are a colony of cells that are working together in near perfect harmony. Not perfect harmony, but near perfect harmony. Theodore Schwann did not know this, but all of the cells of your body have the same DNA. But an eyeball cell is very different than a liver cell. So what's going on there? Well, division of labor has evolved within these colonies. And division of labor it's mediated by cell signaling. As a fetus is developing, the cells are signaling to each other, and they are sending and receiving signals. And according to the signals that they receive, they actually turn certain genes off and turn other genes on. And this causes cellular differentiation. This causes the production of different types of tissues, and different organs, and so on and so forth. The evolution of an organ is the evolution of division of labor. This is extremely important to understand, and it's something that's not talked about a lot in biology. And maybe the reason for that is that the best paper on this topic was just published earlier this year. This paper right here, The Division of Labor and the Evolution of Extreme Specialization. This was published by Guy Cooper and Stuart West in Nature. And they go through here and they look at the mathematics behind division of labor. How is it that division of labor evolves in cells? And actually division of labor also evolves among genes and within a cell. But they looked at the mathematics behind how this stuff happens. Under what situations can division of labor evolve? How is it that cooperation evolves between cells and between genes? This paper is absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, because it's published in Nature, you have to be paying Nature to read their stuff, but you can actually get it at most public libraries. So if you don't already have like a subscription to Nature, you can read this at the public library. So unfortunately, it's stuck behind a paywall, but this paper is absolutely amazing. You know, we in human societies, we divide labor as well, but we do that with our brain, and we use tools like money to help us divide labor. But this talks about how division of labor evolves. Really, really cool paper. And there's a link to that in the video description. I've got all the links to everything important in the video description here, so you can check that out later. So let's talk about the evolution of irreducible complexity, because our bodies are irreducibly complex according to the creationist definition of irreducible complexity. So this word, irreducible complexity, was coined by Michael Behe, the intelligent design advocate. So he's a type of creationist. And because of that, a lot of people in science don't really use it because it was, I don't know, it's like a creationist buzzword. But I actually really like the word. An irreducibly complex structure or system is any system where if you remove one of the parts, the whole system fails. And most of our body, the systems in our body are irreducibly complex. You know, if you remove the heart, the whole body dies. You remove the lungs, the whole body dies. Actually, if you just think about the lungs, you need a diaphragm, you need the lungs, you need the trachea. All of those things need to be there working together or else you die. You get rid of one of those, you'll die. So our bodies are filled with irreducibly complex systems. And the creationists point to this and say, oh, there's no way that an irreducibly complex system could ever evolve because evolution happens through a step-by-step process. Well, of course, they're wrong. They're right that evolution happens through a step-by-step process, but they're wrong to think that irreducible complexity cannot evolve. Irreducible complexity evolves first when an innovation evolves, an innovation of some kind. And innovations can evolve either through exaptation or through division of labor. But once an innovation evolves, the rest of the organism might atrophy afterwards. You know, they don't need to work so hard to do that particular thing that the new organ does, so they will lose the ability to do that. The organism might just get bigger or denser because now it's so efficient at doing something. Let's say it's really efficient because of its kidney at removing waste from its blood. Well, now that the kidney is removing waste from the blood, all of the cells don't have to work so hard to deal with this nasty waste and sludge that they constantly have to deal with. And because of that, the organism can grow larger throughout evolutionary time. The cells can get more dense, and they can also be more active. The more active you are, the more waste you produce if you're a cell. And so in order for something to become active first, they need to evolve a really efficient way to remove that waste. And so when a new organ evolves, that enables a population to get larger, to get denser, or to become more active. And then the third way that irreducible complexity can evolve is that the organism might move into a previously deadly environment. So think about division of labor in humans. Before we had extreme division of labor, where some people can work as engineers, they don't have to bother with, you know, feeding themselves every day. They just go study rocket science all day instead. Before we had division of labor to that extent, everybody had to make their own food, get their own food. They had to hunt, they had to sow, they had to do everything on their own. But once we had really thorough division of labor, we were eventually able to launch humans to live in space. And that was not possible until we had that division of labor. And so we are able to live in an environment that was previously completely deadly for us. And if you were to take that division of labor away from humans, our astronauts would be screwed because nobody down at mission control would be able to go to work because they'd be busy trying to hunt and gather and, you know, sew their clothing and so on. So extreme agriculture is one of the things that humans invented through division of labor. And it's allowed us to dramatically increase our population. So the US population right now is about 325.7 million. And our best estimates of the pre-Columbus population in the United States was about 3.8 million. So the Native Americans at their peak were about 3.8 million strong, so we think. There is another estimate that puts that at 18 million. But either way, they were far less dense. Their populations were far less dense than ours are now today. There were certain civilizations, native civilizations, that were pretty dense, even close to being on par with us. And they did a lot of agriculture and so on. But for the most part, they required a lot of land to sustain a small family or a small group. And I'm not saying that what we have now is better, but what we have now allows us to live in much more dense populations. And because of that, our societies are irreducibly complex. This is the city of Montreal. This is where I now live. Actually, I live across the river from Montreal. But if you were to take out the roads of Montreal and stop goods from coming in and out, I mean, you might also have to take out the ships, but the shipping systems. But if you were to do that, the entire city would die. If you were to take out electricity, the entire city would die. If you were to destroy the bank system, the entire city would die. We don't know what to do without money. We don't know how to interact with each other. If you were to destroy the farms that supply us with food here, we would die. This city is an irreducibly complex system. And it emerged, and we know that it emerged gradually, right? Just a little bit of evidence of this. Back in 1998, there was an ice storm, and it knocked out electricity for 7 days. And just 7 days without electricity, all hell broke loose in Montreal. People had to flee their homes and go into shelters that were run by generators, and it was a state of emergency. People were accidentally lighting their houses on fire because they didn't know how to use their fireplaces properly. They didn't, they've been so used to electricity. Some people were suffocating from smoke inhalation. People were dying from the cold. It was absolutely horrible. 7 days without electricity. Go back in time a little bit, and people were living here just fine. This is a group of people of the Iroquois Nation, and the Iroquois were here in Montreal and lived here for forever without electricity, just fine. And they were able to do that because their population was very loose, very small compared to ours. We're now way too dense. So now we are irreducibly complex, but we weren't always that way. Sea sponges are animals that live just fine without hearts. They don't need, if you take the heart out of a human, we die. But if you take the heart out of a sponge, they're fine. They don't actually have a heart. And the reason for that is that the ocean is their blood. It brings them nutrients, and it takes away the waste products for them. Their cells are very loosely packed. They're not nearly as dense as our bodies, which is, a sponge is full of holes. And their cells don't do much work compared to ours. Ours, we have these muscles, especially our muscles do a lot of work and produce a lot of waste. And so we need a very efficient way to remove that waste. The sponges don't need that. So there's a lot of pros to living like this, living the simple life of a sponge. There's also a lot of cons. One is that you can't live outside of the nutrient-rich seas, and you can't play video games. So there's some cons to that. Fish live just fine without a large intestine. And the reason for that is that the purpose of the large intestine, as we mentioned earlier, is to pull water out of your stool and give that back to the body. Well, fish live in water. They don't really need to conserve water. And so they don't have a large intestine, and they survive just fine. They just have a small intestine. So that's the evolution of irreducible complexity. We know that irreducible complexity can evolve through steps. We see this happen with human societies. Irreducibly complex societies exist. And the same thing happens with organs. The evolution of an organ is the evolution of division of labor. So which came first, the stomach, the skin, the heart, the lungs, the brain, the upper intestine, the liver, the lower intestine, the pancreas, or the kidneys? Well, unfortunately, organs don't fossilize well. Sometimes we do get some hints in the fossil record as to what types of organs an animal had, but for the most part, we don't. So how do we answer this question? How can we even think about this sort of a thing? Well, the answer is we can use phylogeny. By comparing different organisms that we are related to, we can actually watch the evolution of different organs evolve. And when we're doing this, we're doing comparative anatomy of modern organisms that shared a common ancestor at a split. Are there any, I guess before I continue real quick here, are there any pressing questions?
No.
No? Okay. I got Marilyn here helping me out. If you got any pressing questions, particularly to make it easier, you can do at stated casually, and that makes it highlight in orange, so it's easy for me to see. Here we go. So we can use phylogeny to figure this out. And one of the things you might be thinking is how can we use phylogeny to figure out how an organ evolved? Because aren't all of the animals alive today? Haven't they all been evolving just as long as we have? The answer to that question is yes, but evolution is not directional. And that's really important for understanding this because we are extremely complex animals. But evolution doesn't always pull things towards complexity. Evolution actually usually maintains organisms at their current level of complexity. Sometimes evolution actually causes things to lose complexity. So this is a cave fish right here, and you can see he has no eyes. He lost his eyes because his ancestors had been living in the dark for so long that the eyes were useless in the dark. And actually they were just dangerous to have because the eye is extremely susceptible to injury and infection. So fish that just didn't have eyes, that were born with mutations that made their eyes smaller or had skin growing over them, and eventually mutations that got rid of the eyes completely, those fish happened to be more fit for their environment than the fish that had eyes. So sometimes evolution causes things to get simpler with time. Usually it causes them to stay the same. Sometimes natural selection will pull things towards greater levels of complexity. And Richard Dawkins has a wonderful video about this called, you can find it on YouTube. If you look up Richard Dawkins demonstrates the evolution of the eye, he talks about Climbing Mount Improbable, which is one of the books that he wrote. And he's doing this talk at the Royal Society. And he talks about the evolution of the eye. And there's all sorts of different eyes in the animal kingdom. And he talks about all the different stages that the evolution of the eye went through. And he talks about the nautilus. The nautilus is this critter right here that looks kind of like an octopus, but lives in a shell. And they've got a really cool eye. And, our eyes have a lens that helps focus light back on the retina. The nautilus does not have a lens. It's got a pinhole eye. And so here on this diagram here, I've got a couple of different eyes that exist in the animal kingdom in the mollusk group of animals. And this one right here is the water-filled cavity eye with a pinhole instead of a lens. And a pinhole eye is really neat because it allows a pinhole can actually focus light on a retina in a way sort of similar to a lens. You're letting light in through a tiny little spot, and so that allows you to get sharp images. A lens lets the hole get bigger, and you can still have a nice sharp image. And the benefit of a lens is that you can let a lot more light in and still have a nice clear picture. So the nautilus is at a disadvantage compared to the eyes of an octopus, which have a lens. The nautilus is at a disadvantage because it needs a lot of light in order to see. But it can see nice and clear. It just needs a lot of light. If it had a lens, it could do the same thing, but with much less light. So it would be at a huge advantage if it would evolve a lens. But there's a problem here. When you have a pinhole eye, it works super well. And the only way to evolve a lens from a pinhole eye is for skin to grow over the eye hole. And that, of course, because skin cells are not perfectly clear, that would be a disadvantage for the nautilus in most environments. It's got this nice pinhole eye, and it can see just fine. If one were to be born with skin over its eye, even a really thin piece of skin that's pretty clear, that would be a disadvantage because it's still got this small pinhole, and now it's got some gunk covering that pinhole. That's a disadvantage. But if you change the environment just a little bit, let's say that you add a parasite that can get into that eye and eat the retina. Well, now you have a selective advantage for any individual that's born with a cover over its eye. It is going to be able to see slightly less well, but it's not going to be susceptible to that parasite. And so a change in the environment like this can actually allow skin to grow over that eye, and then future mutations can cause that skin to become more and more clear, and then future mutations can cause that skin to bulge and form a lens. And so this is how we get the evolution of complexity, through these really strange situations. But for the most part, natural selection is forcing animals to maintain their current structure. I got a question just yesterday. Someone asked if amphibians are evolving towards a more land-loving lifestyle. Are amphibians eventually going to come out onto land? And the answer to that is no. Amphibians, for the most part, most amphibians, natural selection is keeping them exactly how they are. Any changes to the left or to the right end up being selected against because they're really good at living in the environments that they're living in right now. But there are a couple of individual species, desert toads, for example, which natural selection is really pushing them to be more and more capable on land and in really dry environments. And so it is possible that these desert toads, for example, might eventually be able to leave water for good. Right now, desert toads still have to lay their eggs in water. Aside from that, they can pretty much live like a lizard on dry land, but they need water. They need puddles to lay their eggs in. Some species will dig and find water that way to lay their eggs in, but amphibians are tied to the water because of the way that their eggs work. But you could eventually in the future get a group of these frogs to, end up evolving an egg that does not dry out and can be laid right onto land. That's definitely a possibility. And in fact, that is what happened in the past. There was a small group of amphibians that branched off from the main group because they went onto land, and they ended up giving rise to all of the reptiles and birds and mammals. So that has happened in the past. But most of the amphibians stayed in the water, and they're still there. And because of that, because evolution is not directional, we can actually use phylogeny to see how different organs evolved, because most organisms are still living fairly close to the way that they were when these organs first started evolving. And if we compare all the different critters on the family tree, we can piece together how these organs evolved. Just as evidence that increases in complexity are rare, that most things stay the same, bacteria are 35 times heavier than all animals combined. If you dry them out and just weigh their carbon, the dry weight of bacteria is 35 times heavier than the dry weight of all animals combined. So bacteria, among the simplest creatures on Earth, are among the most effective. They are doing the best. They are the most prevalent. And there's this wonderful paper right here called The Biomass Distribution on Earth that I recommend looking up. It is free. It's completely free. And there's tons of really cool information in there. So I recommend checking that out. The Biomass Distribution on Earth. Super fun. Anyway, comparative anatomy. Here we go. So we're gonna start looking at single-celled eukaryotes. A particular group of single-celled eukaryotes called Choanoflagellates. Well, first of all, are there any big questions that I should answer before I move on?
No, but I have seen a comment that's a little bit interesting. I don't know if you will find it interesting.
Yeah.
It's from Jay. He says the same trait can evolve several times in separate species. The trait fits to the environment, and there are several spots on Earth that have the same environment.
Right. So what he's talking about, I don't know if you're able to hear that, but it was mentioned that traits can evolve multiple times, and it's the environment that can select for those traits. And this is true. This is actually one of the problems with comparative anatomy. One of the difficulties with comparative anatomy is that sometimes a trait will evolve more than once. But through very carefully studying how a trait emerges when you look at embryos, you can actually tell a lot of times whether or not an organ evolved twice through what's called convergent evolution, or if it evolved once and we have inherited a different version of that old organ. So we're going to look at the kidneys, for example, today in hagfish. And the kidneys in lancelets also have a kidney-like structure. They have an organ that helps filter their internal fluids, but it's not really related to a kidney at all. It uses a totally different process. It emerges from a different part of the body. But hagfish have a structure that's, some people would argue it's not really a kidney, but it is the start of a kidney, and it's using the same mechanisms that our kidneys use today, and it's using the same genes that our kidneys use today to do what it does. And because of that, we consider it to be a legitimate kidney, not just analogous to a kidney, but homologous to a modern kidney. So if it's homologous, that means that it's actually a primitive version of the modern structure. If it's analogous, it means that it's a separately evolved structure. And scientists who do comparative anatomy, they spend a lot of time trying to figure out, is this organ homologous or analogous to the ones that other organisms have? And this has been a huge part of biology, which is really taking off now with genetics and with what's called evo-devo, the study of evolutionary development. We can tell really clearly now whether or not a structure evolved through convergent evolution, or and actually one organ evolved from a previous organ that we see elsewhere in the family tree. So, Choanoflagellates. These are single-celled organisms. They live in the ocean. I think there's some freshwater species as well. They have a big, long tail, a flagella. This is different than the bacterial flagella, by the way, because these are eukaryotic single-celled organisms. Their tail oscillates instead of spins. But they can swim around and live their lives as a free-living individual, or they can pair up with partners and form multi-celled structures. And they do so depending on what types of food are around them. And scientists who study this have found that the cell signals that they use, the signaling that they send to each other, is the same as the cell signaling used in our cells. Well, it is slightly different, but there's a handful of genes that they use that are the same as the genes that our cells use to signal to each other, and for differentiation and for sticking to each other. Our cells stick to each other as well, just like these guys do. And so this group of organisms is extremely fascinating to biologists that want to understand the origin of multicellular organisms, because these guys can live as individuals or as multicelled organisms. Their skin is their mouth. So, we want to know how skin evolved and how the mouth, or how the stomach evolved. Their skin is their skin, and it's their stomach. Through endocytosis, they absorb food particles through their skin. They form these little balls that capture the food. And through exocytosis, they excrete waste out into the water. And it's the same process in reverse. So there's a packet with waste in it, and that packet goes to the cell membrane, goes to the skin of the cell, and then it excretes that. So these things have no organs, really. They're just single cells. and their skin and their stomach is literally the same thing. Going on to sponges. Sponges are, their lineage goes back to the earliest animal fossils that we have. The earliest animal fossil that we have is a sponge. It's way before the Cambrian. And sponges have very simple cellular differentiation. They have some cells that still have their little tails, just like these Choanoflagellates do. And some of their cells don't have tails. Some of their cells just act as body support. And these cells feed each other. So they're cooperating with one another to form these giant three-dimensional structures. And they wiggle their little flagella and they pump water. Their body is spongy, and they suck water through all these holes all throughout their body. They're collecting food that passes through, and then that water spits out these tubes that we see here. And that's sea sponges. There's very simple cellular differentiation. And if you look here at the structure of a sponge, you see that the cells that are used for feeding are almost identical to those choanoflagellates, those single-celled organisms that we saw earlier. And by the way, we have cells like this in our body as well. They're actually a little bit different now, but we still use the same flagella. We use them, we call them cilia. They're in our lungs, but they're the exact same structure. They're in our intestines, they're in our lungs, they're all over the place. These little hairs that wiggle around, and in our lungs, it's used to get phlegm out of our lungs, and so on and so forth. So with the choanoflagellates, there's really no difference between the skin and the stomach. And the same is still pretty much true for the sponge. There is cellular differentiation, but the stomach, you could say, is kind of spread all out amongst the skin and the body cells. Everything's all kind of mixed. There's no clear differentiation between the stomach and the skin. In Cnidarians, we finally get the division between skin and stomach. And these animals are really funny because their mouth and their anus is actually the same organ. They swallow things and then regurgitate them afterwards. But their gut is on the inside. They've got very highly specified cells on the inside for digesting food. They excrete digestive enzymes, and then they absorb food, and then they feed the rest of the cells of the body. So they pass nutrients from cell to cell. And then you have the outside of the animal, which is just, that's where its skin is. So here you finally have a clear differentiation between the gut and the skin. And so our questioner was asking, what organ evolved first, the skin or the gut? Well, they actually evolved at the same time because they're actually the division of one thing. The skin and the gut were one thing, and then they divided into two things. And Cnidarians, by the way, this is a group of animals that includes all jellyfish, all anemones, and corals. And that's where we get the evolution of the gut and the skin. And that's also where we start to see the evolution of the brain. We don't have a brain yet. You've probably heard that jellyfish don't have brains. Instead, anemones and jellyfish, they have what are called nerve nets. They do have nerves, and their nerves are very similar to ours. In fact, they use the same proteins for cell signaling between different nerves and so on. But they don't have a brain. It hasn't condensed into one area of the body yet. So there we finally have the evolution of the skin and the stomach. And actually, technically, we call it the gut because it's not really differentiated into a stomach yet. So it's the skin and the gut and the nerve net. Next, moving closer to us on the family tree, we have Hemichordates. And Hemichordates are very special worms. They're very similar to us. They're strikingly similar to us. Here on the right, we have some Hemichordate poop. These things are found again in the Precambrian, so before the Cambrian explosion. we have trace fossils that these things were existing. These little tubes of feces here, sand-like feces, we find these in the fossil record before the Cambrian explosion. We don't have clear examples of actual fossilized hemichordates, but we have all the signs that they existed. And one of their major innovations, they've got a mouth and they've got an anus. So that's nice. You don't have to use the same hole for both functions. And they have a coelom. And a coelom is just a body cavity that exists. It's a liquid-filled cavity that exists between the digestive tract. I've got the digestive tract there in green. There's a cavity between that and the outer tissues of the body. And this is really neat because this allows these organisms, once that evolved, these organisms were able to get much larger than their ancestors were. And they're able to be much more active than their ancestors were. And the reason for that is that this liquid allows the gut to digest food and then squirt nutrients into this liquid. And that liquid, within that liquid, that nutrients can dissipate and reach every part of the body. It's like a really primitive blood system. And that allows all of the body to receive nutrients from the gut. And so the gut doesn't have to, these cells don't have to work super hard to pass nutrients from one cell to the next. This can happen passively through this liquid in the coelom. These guys also evolved to what are kind of like blood vessels inside their bodies. And you know, the coelom is open, so they have an open circulatory system, but there are some tubes in there, and these tubes allow, when the worm is moving around, that kind of allows that liquid to squish around inside the body, and it sort of gets pumped. They don't have hearts, they don't have a true heart, but the little head of this worm, the vessels go into that head, and that when the head moves, it kind of pumps things like a heart. So they're kind of on their way to having a circulatory system. They don't really have one yet, but they've just got this open circulatory system, really basic one. So there you've got the proto-blood and proto-blood vessels forming. Moving forward to simple chordates. How are we doing on time?
143.
Oh, good. I've got 15 minutes. I try to keep these under an hour. But here we have the simple chordates, and there's all kinds of cool innovations that have happened in them. These are lancelets. And they have a brain. So the worm we were looking at earlier, it has a little bit denser neural net than the jellyfish has. But here we actually have a chordate, means it has a nerve running down its back. And it also has the beginnings of a brain. Now, we actually didn't think that they had a brain for a long time. It was just recently that we realized that they do have a brain. They have the beginnings of a brain. And we realized this by studying the gene expression in these animals. They actually have a forebrain and a hindbrain, and then the spinal cord. But we weren't able to tell that until we actually looked at the molecules that these nerves are using. So this is officially, nowadays, this is officially where we say that the brain evolved, is in very simple chordates. Excuse me. The other really cool innovation in these chordates is that they have a proto-liver. Now, it's very different from our liver. It's not like it's its own separate organ. It's actually just a pocket in the digestive tract, but it's doing all sorts of things that a liver does. You know, our liver, one of its main functions is to take in molecules that are otherwise toxic and break those apart, metabolize really nasty chemicals. And this proto-liver here does that for this animal. And it does all sorts of other things that livers do today. And so we consider this to be a proto-liver, the first origins of the liver. Last but not least, this thing has nice blood vessels that are very similar to the blood vessels in modern fish, but there is no heart. The blood vessels themselves have muscles in them, and the blood vessels can contract. And you might know that today our arteries or veins that contract? It's the arteries. Yeah. The arteries in our bodies also contract. And this mechanism this first emerged in these very simple chordates, Precambrian times. This is a long, long time ago that this stuff first started to evolve. But there is no heart here yet. But there is this really nice blood vessel system. There are still some parts of their circulatory system that are open, just like the worms were. So the blood vessels will just go into a body cavity. There's big sinuses where the blood, I'm saying blood in quotes here because there's no blood cells yet. It's just liquid. But we're getting a really nice vascular system evolving here already. Really cool. Moving forward to the Jawless Vertebrates. This is a hagfish, and I think these fish are super cool. They excrete all kinds of mucus out of their skin. If you try and catch one with your hands, it'll just coat itself in slime. They're really gross, weird animals. But in their bodies, they have a legitimate liver. I mean, there's no doubt that this is a liver. It's doing the same things that the proto-liver was doing, but it's now doing them in a manner much more similar to ours. Their brain is very developed, and they also have the first heart, the earliest example of a heart. They actually have 4 hearts, not just one. But one of their hearts is special in that it works the same way that ours does, in a way that's very similar to ours. The rest of their hearts use just muscles of the body. But that heart in the middle there that I'm highlighting here, that's using legitimate cardiac tissue. It's evolved some very, very special cell signaling mechanisms so that it acts very similar to our heart. Now, this animal has very low blood pressure compared to modern or other vertebrates, more advanced vertebrates, but it does have a heart. It pumps its blood, and its circulatory system it still is open. There are some areas that have big, just, pockets where the blood fills, but its circulatory system is much more complete than the other circulatory systems that we've looked at, and there are legitimate blood cells. There's hemoglobin. It's a very primitive version of hemoglobin, but there is hemoglobin here. Also, they have a proto-kidney, and this kidney works in a way very similar to ours. Now it's spread out and it's messy. It's not these nice, neat little organs like we have, but they do have a proto-kidney, and it filters their blood and it pulls out nasty chemicals and spits that out into the cloaca to be excreted by the body. Last but not least, it has a proto-pancreas. The pancreas in humans creates digestive enzymes at one end, and it creates regulatory hormones out the other end into the blood. And there is, in humans, it's a very distinct organ, but in these jawless vertebrates, it's kind of spread out in different patches throughout the digestive tract. So it's not a full-on legitimate organ yet, but these cells are starting to, the cells that produce these enzymes are starting to form organ-like structures. And this is how organs evolve. They evolve by the division of labor, right? So moving on, we've got cartilaginous fishes. So these are things like sharks and rays, and they're a very, very early group of fish. They split off very early on the way towards land animals. And they have the first legitimate stomach and the first legitimate small intestine. So remember, before we said that animals had a gut, and actually, if you look at the jawless vertebrates, they really just have a gut. It's just one big long. You could call it an intestine, or you could call it a stomach. It's neither. It's kind of both. It's just one big long thing. But in these cartilaginous fishes, you have the division of the small intestine and the stomach. And the stomach is specialized now for being highly acidic and squeezing food and breaking it into pieces, and the intestine is specialized for absorbing those molecules after the food's been broken up. So you have this division of labor. Instead of doing all the smashing and all the absorbing, you have one spot for smashing and dissolving and one spot for absorbing. And that's a huge advance that dramatically increased the efficiency of these animals. So the small intestine and the stomach are very clearly differentiated in those fish. Finally, we have bony fishes, the evolution of bony fishes. And this, believe it or not, is where lungs evolved. And you might think, what the heck? That you're showing a coral reef fish. You know, it's what I'm forgetting the name of that fish right now. I used to have one in my aquarium. Surgeon. I'm forgetting his name, but it doesn't have lungs. And so you might be like, what the heck? Why are we using this for the evolution of lungs? Well, it has a swim bladder. And what we found is that very early on in the evolution of bony fishes, they evolved lungs. And it appears that the lung evolved as fish moved into really nasty waters along the shores where bacteria had been consuming a lot of the oxygen that was around. And so this is just stagnant water, decomposing plant material and so on, caused the water to be stagnant. And so these fish would have been up at the surface, sucking up air and mixing that with water to push that over their gills. And that was the only way to survive in that really nasty water. Well, the inside of your mouth is covered in blood vessels, and those blood vessels can actually absorb oxygen as well. And so what we think happened is that by doing this, if you had a goldfish and its water has gone stagnant, you've probably seen this happen. He's up at the top of his bowl, grabbing air and shoving it through his gills. This would have been very similar to what was happening in the past. And eventually, a larger pocket would have evolved in the back of the throat for absorbing this oxygen, the actual oxygen, instead of having to wet it first and pass it through the gills. You would get the evolution of a larger oxygen absorbing organ. And then eventually you would get these entire bubbles, these entire organs that can fill up with air and inhale and exhale eventually evolved. And we think that all early bony fish had lungs, full-on legitimate lungs. In a small group, those maintained until today. So on the right, I have it's called a bitcher fish. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correct, but these things can actually live on land. And here in Montreal, there's a researcher that raises them on land. They don't normally live on land, but she raises them on land and just makes it super humid in their little environment. And they'll like walk around, and it's really cool. They just live their whole lives on land. And there's a video in the video description. There's a link that you can go watch a video about those guys. But these things they have a really ancient connection to the early lunged fish. They still have their lungs, and most other fish, those have since evolved into a swim bladder. So the swim bladder that goldfish have, the swim bladder that most aquarium fish have, that actually is derived from ancient lungs. But some fish kept those lungs until today. Here is an example of those lungs in a surgery. This is that same fish is walking around on land here. This is a surgery showing you the lungs. There's the right lung and the left lung. And that's what they breathe with. They can breathe on land with those things. They also have gills, but they don't need to use them. They can just get air from the oxygen from the air. Last but not least, we have tetrapods. So one group of these lunged fish, these lunged lobe-finned fish, came out onto land and gave rise to tetrapods. Tetrapods are all the land animals with 4 legs and lungs and a backbone. And even in early amphibians, we find the evolution of the last organ of question here, and that is the large intestine. The large intestine appears to have evolved in early amphibians. Almost all tetrapods have them. I should point out that the evolution of new structures in the digestive tract and the evolution, you can gain them and lose them fairly easily. We actually watched this happen in real time. There's a group of reptiles that were put on an island, and they evolved a new chamber in their intestines really quickly because most of the food on that island was vegetable matter, and they had previously specialized on insects. And to facilitate the digestion of vegetable matter, a new structure inside the intestines ended up evolving. I got that backwards. A new structure inside the intestines evolved, and that facilitated the digestion of vegetation for them. So this can actually happen a lot, and there are some amphibians that have kind of lost their large intestine, but we think that the ancestor of all tetrapods developed one. And what that enabled this ancestor to do is to live on dry land for larger lengths of time, because the large intestine allows the reabsorption of water from the digestive tract. And so it helps you so you don't dry out. So there we have it. Which organ evolved first? Skin, stomach, brain, liver, heart, kidney, pancreas, upper intestine, lungs, or lower intestine? Well, if we look at our family tree here and do a little bit of comparative anatomy, we can actually figure that out with not perfect certainty, but a fairly high degree of certainty. And the reason that there are some doubts is because, of course, throughout evolutionary time, an organ can evolve and then be lost. And so we might think that something didn't evolve until, vertebrates, but in fact it evolved earlier but was lost in all of the ancestors. So there is some degree of uncertainty here, but we can be pretty certain that the answer to this question is this order right here. The skin and stomach evolved at the same time, actually. Then the brain evolved in these primitive chordates. Then we have the liver that evolved. Then we have the heart. And after the heart, we have the kidneys. And you might be wondering, the heart and kidneys on our family tree, they appear at the same time. They appear in the hagfish. But we know that the heart must have evolved first, because kidneys require blood pressure in order to work. The kidney works by shoving liquid from the blood through very small tubes, and you need blood pressure in order to do that. And so either the heart had to evolve first, or really strong arteries that could pulsate. So most likely the heart evolved first there, but on that question, there is some ambiguity. Maybe the kidneys evolved first when you had these really strong arteries that could pump blood. But most likely it was the heart, then the kidneys. Then we have the pancreas, which evolved. And again, the pancreas first emerged as this proto-pancreas that was very spread out. Then we have the upper intestine. Then we have the lungs. Then we have the lower intestine. And that is the order in which things evolved. So that does it for time, but I would like to answer questions. So let me just go back to hello again. Let me pull up questions if there are any. Is there anything we really need to address there, Marilyn?
Not a lot of questions, but there's some interesting comment maybe you want to hear about.
Yeah, well, real quick, I do see one question. Are they like lampreys? Yes, they are. They're very similar. Lampreys and hagfish are extremely similar. And also, sorry, I'm going to say your name wrong. Epic Indward water lettuce. Thank you for the super chat. I appreciate it. Let's see. Sorry, what was the interesting question or the comment that you had?
We have Junkers CN that says a lot of the body's machinery evolved out of the gastrointestinal tract. processing food was the #1 priority.
Yeah, processing food was a #1 priority. And as we saw, the stomach, the gut evolved before the brain. So yeah, that is very fascinating. Cool. Well, I think Junker ZN says, should we throw more complexity into the works by talking about gene expression? Previously evolved and then lost mechanisms can re-express more quickly later if they are needed again. Yeah, that's true. I mean, the evolution of an organ is the division of labor, and the division of labor is really facilitated by communication between cells. And so once your communication system evolves, even if that organ ends up going away throughout evolutionary time, it is easier for something similar to that organ to reappear because the communication mechanisms between those cells do still exist in a lot of cases, not every case. Sometimes they'll just get completely lost throughout evolutionary time. But yeah, you do get what are called atavisms. Atavisms, I think I'm saying that right, where an old structure will just pop up in an animal. One example of this, there's a dolphin that has hind legs. Well, it's got fins where the hind legs would be. There's atavisms in horses too. You'll get horses with extra toes. A horse just walks on its middle fingers and the middle finger toe. But you'll get atavisms where a horse will be born with 3 fingers instead of just 1. So that happens quite a bit. Vibrantly Brantley says, serious question. What kind of fish was that when you were showing their lungs? Was it a snakehead? That was the bichir. I'm probably saying it wrong. Bichir fish. And there's a video about those guys in the video description. You can check that out. Someone says, before the heart evolved, how did species procreate without love? I guess they were all just animals. Let's see. All right. I think that wraps it up for questions. Anything else that we missed or should talk about, Marilyn? I think that sums it up. No? Well, thank you for coming. Again, if someone wants to cut out pieces of that and make some little highlight videos, that would be awesome. Just email me, Jon, Jon, at statedclearly.com. And we can, I can send you the video file for this and you can hack it up and make little clips. And again, it's not a huge deal if this stuff shows up on other YouTube channels. I'm not going to flip out about that, but I would prefer to have it sent to me. That'd be awesome. So thank you. I will see you next week. So long.